Velkommen alle sammen. It makes me sad to see brothers fighting amongst each other. There have been a few, not many, but a small number of Scandinavians in the comments section in online groups who seem to think they are better in some way or above others or quote-unquote more Viking than Scandinavians who don't live in Scandinavia, who may have ancestry. Now, you all had to get me involved in it, didn't you? Yes, me too. I was not born and raised in Scandinavia either. Do I have less Norse blood in my DNA now? I've lived many places in the world. Yes, my parents came to the United States just before I was born. What was I supposed to do? Was I just supposed to be born out of my mother, and when I'm 5 minutes old, I pack my suitcase and say, "Sorry, Mama, I have to move back to Norway, so in 30 years when I make a YouTube channel, people will think I'm a real Viking." So, now you all had to get me involved in the argument, and I hope this will get us to stop fighting amongst each other. So in this video, I'm speaking about how in the Viking Age, the best and strongest Scandinavians, whoa, some people are not gonna like this one very much, but in the Viking Age, just like today, the most badass Scandinavians are the ones who were born and raised outside of Scandinavia. In the Viking Age too, this was similar. There were plenty of famous badass Vikings born and raised at home in Scandinavia, but the ones you have all actually heard about, and the ones that accomplished the most that we read about in the history books, there were much more of them who were born or raised abroad. But hey, if you disagree, that's fine. Just let us know down below in the comments. Tell us your favorite Viking, where was he from, where was he born, where did he grow up, and we can see which side gets more votes. Just be nice to each other, no need to fight. We are all brothers, and we can all come together, Scandinavians around the world, and we can join forces and make fun of the Swedes. Oh, that's good. I'm just kidding. I love the Swedes. Just have to poke fun at them whenever we get the chance. So, on to the sources. So this migration out of Scandinavia kind of started with Harald Fairhair. His hair may have been fair, but his way of ruling was very unfair. He took away people's freedoms, he raised taxes, and he was basically a shitty leader of Norway unless you kissed his ass and followed his agenda and all of Harald's stupid rules. Look, the exact same thing is happening today in Scandinavia. So the result is, a lot of people moved out of Norway at this time in the early to mid-Viking Age. They migrated to places before this, of course, but now in the mid-Viking Age is when we see Scandinavians actually settling down and starting families elsewhere. One of the earliest of these was the Scottish Northern Isles, the Shetlands and the Orkneys. One of these, who was born here, was Rollo, who you all know from Vikings. Rollo was a son of the Jarl of the Orkneys, named Rögnvald. So the Rollo that we all know was born and raised in the Scotland area. At least according to the Icelandic sources, this is the Rollo, or Gangerjulf as he was called in those sources, that conquered Normandie, but other sources say different things about the Rollo and his origins. He could be Danish, just be aware of that, but the Icelandic sources say he was Norwegian, growing up in the Scottish Isles. We can also speak about the descendants of Rollo, many of the dukes of Normandy. They were, of course, mostly Danes, and they were born and raised in France, and even leading up to William the Conqueror, who lived 150 years after Rollo, but he was still mostly Scandinavian ancestry, and William the Conqueror ended up conquering England. And those were all Danes with a little bit of pretty French noblewoman DNA in there. They had been in France for many generations at the time, but still kept their Norse cultural identity. But back to Scotland, some of the greatest heroes of the whole Viking Age were born and raised there. We have another one named Jarl Einar, who defended his earldom from a son of Harald Fairhair named Halfdan Longleg, and Jarl Einar carved the blood eagle on Halfdan, one of the only blood eagles that we have on record, actually. We also have someone named Thorstein the Red, who proclaimed himself a king of Caithness actually, and Sutherland on mainland Scotland, which was the only Norwegian to be king of a part of Scotland for some time. But if you want to know one of the baddest Vikings who ever lived, his name was Jarl Thorfinn, who was actually a grandson of Malcolm, king of the Scots, and he was 1/4 Scottish, yeah, but he was raised in the Norse areas of Scotland. He got screwed out of some of his rightfully inherited lands, and he waged a battle and raided all over Scotland, and he won a couple of the greatest battles of the age at Dyrnes and Turfnes, where the Norse were greatly outnumbered by the Scots, and they came away with the victory every single time. Thorfinn even escaped assassination and came back to reclaim his power after all his men were killed. I did a video on this, and you can read about all of it in Orkneys saga, all the most badass Vikings that were born and raised in Scotland, or the Scottish Isles. Moving on, let's speak about some of the Vikings that were raised in England. My absolute favorite king of the whole Viking Age was named Haakon the Good. Haakon was a son of Harald Fairhair, and Harald was actually good friends with the English king Athelstan, and he fostered his son to Athelstan, so Haakon was raised in England by the English king. When he became an adult, he moved back to Norway and became the greatest king we ever had in history. He was kind and generous with his wealth, giving the people their freedom, and he was also one of the fiercest warriors to ever live, undefeated in battle. We can also speak maybe about the sons of Erik bloodaxe. Erik bloodaxe was a brother of Haakon, and quite an unfair ruler in Norway actually, and he was chased out of his country. So he ruled over a region of England actually for some time, and that is where the sons of Erik bloodaxe were mainly born and raised. Now, Erik bloodaxe, we think he had somewhere from 16 to 20 children, so he had a lot. But the most notable of his sons were Harald Greycloak, who was also a king of Norway, Sigurd Sleva, Rögnvald and Gamle. Those were the sons that basically mustered up large numbers of Danish warriors and tried to invade Norway multiple times, and after Haakon died they ended up being successful, and they participated in some of the greatest battles Norway had ever seen, and all of these sons had spent at least substantial time in their youth, if not their whole childhood, raised in England, okay? Next, we can also maybe speak about Knut the Great, a Danish king, and he was even a king of England for some time, and he did some amazing things, not just for Denmark and England, but all over Europe. Knut's father, Svein Forkbeard, was also a king of England for a short time, so Knut the Great would have spent at least some of his childhood raised in England. And let's move on to Ireland. We can speak about Rodulf, recorded in Irish sources, mainly as having a few different names that I'll put up on the screen right here. Rodulf was a Dane that went on some of the most epic raids in the UK and took up residence in Ireland for some time. But we think he was actually raised in Frisia for a big part of his childhood, because Rodulf was a cousin of the Frisia-based Danish Duke Rorik of Dorestad, and the son of Harald the Younger, who also spent significant time in the mid-800s when Rodulf was young, so we think he was raised a lot of his life in Frisia. Speaking of Frisia, we have even one source saying that Redbad was actually a Dane. Redbad really needs no introduction. He was the greatest hero in Frisian or Dutch history, and this source actually here says that he was a Dane and called Frisia his home. But of course there are conflicting sources on that. This is just one of them. Another great Irish Viking was named Kjartan. Don't forget, when the Vikings established Dublin, basically, this is a Norse name, Dublin, and he settled in Ireland for a long period of time, and there would have been many, many great Vikings born and raised in Ireland. But one of the best was Kjartan. He was actually raised in Iceland with a Norwegian father, but an Irish mother who was actually a daughter of the great Irish king Mir Kjartan. So yeah, she was a slave, and it was a product of non-consensual relations, Kjartan's mother. But the great Kjartan was born because of this, and he lived to do some legendary deeds. While we were on the subject of Iceland, we have to speak about a couple Icelanders. They were mainly Norwegians, sometimes with some Irish DNA in there. So these were the Norwegians who really had some balls. The ass-kissing Norwegians who didn't mind all of their freedoms being taken and wealth being taken under rulers like Harald Fairhair, Olav Tryggvason, Olav the Saint. They left their country in Norway in pursuit of freedom. And what was resulted was they settled in Iceland, and they became some of the most badass Vikings ever. There are just way too many to mention here, but we have to say something, of course, about Egil Skallagrimsson. His name speaks for itself. He was a giant of a man. He was the #1 top Viking of the whole Viking Age. Sometimes he was said to take on dozens of men all by himself. Okay, they might be a little bit over-exaggerated, but even if half the stories about him are true, he would have been the #1 Viking legend that all other Scandinavians of the time would have aspired to be. A couple other famous Icelanders are, of course, Erik the Red and his son Leif Erikson, who were the ones discovering Greenland and then the Americas, bravely sailing out into the abyss with no knowledge of where they would end up. Even the women of Iceland were actually tougher than back home in Scandinavia, such as Freydis Eiriksdottir, the sister of Leif, who accompanied him on his journey and showed what a badass woman she was, organizing people getting killed, and even she could fight. She would take up weapons and basically threaten the Native Americans who were on their property to basically go away. So these and many more legendary Icelanders were all born and raised outside of Scandinavia, but Scandinavian ancestry. Now, to finish off, let's go to the east. We can finally put a couple of Swedes on our list of badasses here, okay? Maybe the most badass Swede was Ingvar the Far-Travelled. He led expeditions all throughout the east and fought in battles as far as the Byzantine Empire and modern-day Georgia. So he was a Swede that spent most of his life in the east. We can also speak about the Rus Vikings. All of the early Rus Viking princes of Novgorod and Kiev were basically Swedish settlers of the east. Sviatoslav, Oleg, Igor, or the earliest one of them all, Rorik. They were all Swedes who had raided and eventually settled in the east, and still 200 years after they had first settled there, they kept their Norse language and identity, and they kept close ties with their distant family in Scandinavia. These are the founders of Russia and Ukraine as we know it, and it all started with some badass Swedes living abroad. It wasn't just the Swedes though. Some of the most legendary Norwegians spent time in the east as well. Olav Tryggvason, who was a horrible man and a horrible king, but he really was a great and brave warrior, and he developed his prowess being raised in the east. He spent his early childhood in the Baltic countries, and then he went down to Kiev, where he was raised and loved by the prince there, Vladimir the Great. And as a young man, he served in the Eastern Roman Empire's military forces, where he achieved the highest ranks. He eventually came back to Norway later on in life, and he became king. He did some very horrible things to the pagans there, but I have to admit he was a great warrior and powerful ruler. And again, raised most of his childhood in the east. Another one is Olav the Saint. Another horrible king, but a great, great brave warrior. Born in Norway and raised his first few years there, but he was raised for a big part of his childhood in the Baltic countries and England too, actually. The most famous one raised in the east, though, however, is Harald Hardrada, who lived in exile from a young age. He was born in Norway, but was forced to flee into the east as a teenager. He grew up in Kiev, and when he was a young man, he also served in the Eastern Roman Empire and the Varangian Guard, and he was a personal guard of the emperor and fought countless battles in the Mediterranean and Middle East, winning him the highest military rankings there. And then he returned to Norway when he was about 30, and he became king of Norway and did many great things. And this leads us to the end of the Viking Age, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harald died in the year 1066. So there you go, guys. Those are just a few of the most famous Vikings born and raised outside of Scandinavia, but there are lots more. Like I said, list them down below, all the Vikings that may have been born and raised in Scandinavia that were among the fiercest warriors. For example, Haakon the Jarl is arguably the best Viking to ever live, and he was all about Norway. He never left Norway unless it was on a raid, and he didn't even want to hear about anything other than his homeland. I'm just saying, there are much more Vikings who were badasses, who were raised, born or raised outside of Scandinavia than there were ones who were born and raised at home. So you can argue about it in the comments, just be kind to each other. You see, something about top quality Norse genetics, but raised in a place a little less soft, breeds some of the best warriors the world has ever seen. So I hope this video helps. The country you were born in has literally zero effect on your DNA and ancestry, and I hope we can all stop fighting amongst each other, because there might just be a time in the future where it is really time to unite and look after each other, as we have done before many other times in history. So that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed. Vi ses nästa gång.